Hello everyone, and I of course use everyone very liberally to mean one person, if I even upload this, but I've decided that I'm going to do a Q&A. And I think this will be fun just for myself. I enjoy answering questions, but also as a potential archive for down the line if I ever become a more serious YouTuber, so to speak, what I was like now. As part of my experiment in creating a comprehensive psychological profile of myself, of course, I have access to an AI which is tailored to me. So I thought, what better person than my own AI mirror to ask questions? So let's get started. So the first question it asked, and it's interesting to see the choice of questions it had, was what is something you used to moralize but now simply don't care about? This is interesting. You'll probably learn a lot about me through what my psychological profile has decided to ask me. And for those who aren't familiar with that, which is probably everyone, because this is one of my first videos, I wrote a huge amount from descriptions about how I think and about myself to also spontaneous journaling and tens of thousands, well, hundreds of thousands of words in the end, which was all uploaded into a particular language model that I also helped train and guide. And that came up with a psychological, I guess more technically you could call it a psychographic profile of me. And anyway, this is what I've been asking. And so it tells you a little bit about me through the nature of the questions it asks. So there's a broad, more serious answer to what I used to moralize, but the question is specifically, but now simply don't care about. So the more serious, broad elements of my moralistic thinking have not completely gone. So the things I simply don't care about would be adhering to a specific diet framework. So this is quite an obvious answer for anyone who knows me. Although I love creating really detailed frameworks and getting into all the health philosophies, and I have a very rigorous diet that works with me, which is broadly aligned with sort of Ray Peat, or rather inspired by Ray Peat and the bioenergetic pro-metabolic space. It's very, very tailored to me and my own personal philosophy and tastes. So I have no interest in adhering to a carnivore, a vegan, or whatever diet on moral grounds. I think there's a fair argument for veganism, but I just don't think it's inherently unethical to eat meat if it's procured in particular ways. But I'm always up for discussing that. Again, always correct me if I'm wrong. So that's one thing I simply don't care about, that I used to moralize. I used to interpret these dogmatic internet gurus, and because of my probably to some degree neurodiversity, I would interpret it very, very literally and find it very hard to process that they're either lying or just wrong, which then lends itself to many contradictions and internal turmoil. So that's definitely something I don't care about anymore, but used to moralize. You'd watch some random video about some schizophrenic guy saying you have to drink blood, otherwise you're gay. And I'm like, well, damn, I don't want to be gay. Obviously nothing wrong with being gay. But I would be like, what? I'm not supposed to... What? I'm not supposed to drink blood, but this guy says I should. Obviously do not care about that anymore, especially as I've learned, assuming I am neurodiverse, how I would have been a overly moralistic and, to use a technical term, bordering on scrupulosity. So the next question on this same theme of existential and personal philosophy, is suffering ever morally required? So this is a really interesting question. I don't think it is required in the sense of punishment, which might be quite controversial. I am not prude, so to speak, about punishment when it actually reduces harm. I'm not one of these people who says the death penalty, more serious penalties like that, are inherently unacceptable, because there are, I think, some things that profoundly attack the very substructure of civilization that, if allowed to continue, threaten the very existence of what we would call a civilized society, that is, a society free of threats of violence. And in some instances, there might be justification for harm and suffering, but that is practical. It's not for the sake of punishment. It would be for the sake of deterrence. I'm generally not a big fan of that as well. So it's worth remembering, I don't like retributive justice. I don't think somebody does something bad and they should be hurt for the sake of it at all. And so that's where my headspace is. And it's a little unusual because you have all these people who are like, be more violent, be more accepting of the death penalty online. And then you see them post videos about burglars getting torn to pieces, and it's vile and horrible, and they love it. And I'm not interested in revenge fantasies. I don't like it. It doesn't make me feel comfortable. That's not to say there's no unconscious part of me that it appeals to, but generally I don't like it. And I think that rehabilitation for most crimes is a good idea. But I definitely don't think suffering is morally required as a form of punishment. I think harm reduction is the most important thing. And if punishment needs to be a part of that, even in extreme cases, then I'm actually okay with that. So I've probably alienated anyone who's super pro death penalty and also alienated anyone who's super pro rehabilitation. In other words, I'm very pro rehabilitation, very anti-suffering on a moral basis, unless there's a practical reason for it, which there usually isn't, but in some extreme cases there might be. The more interesting question is it ever morally required personally? And I think to be a truly moral person, you have to understand pain, and to understand pain, you must have suffered. So I think it is morally required in the sense that some suffering is required to be a truly moral person. Not chronically, not constantly, not self-indulgently. But I think an ability to suffer is a prerequisite for being a moral being. So next, do you want power or just to stop feeling powerless? Jesus Christ. I might skip some of these. This is also a fun little test in just what has the AI asked me. What if you had a psychological profile of yourself? What if you had an AI mirror of yourself? Would it ask you? That's a fun little part, an element to this. The honest answer, do you want power or just to stop feeling powerless? I think it's kind of a redundant question. They are one and the same. If you want power, you want to stop feeling powerless. If you want to stop feeling powerless, you want power. For me, they are actually two sides of the same coin. What emotion do you secretly think is more useful than happiness? That I cannot answer without a specific use case. I think happiness is generally the most useful for general functioning, but we'd have to get a specific scenario working. Is it more useful in this instance? Are you trying to lift a car because it's about to crush your leg? Well, being happy in that moment is not the most useful. So what emotion do I secretly think is more useful than happiness? Entirely depends on the circumstance. Next question. What part of yourself are you still pretending is temporary? Jesus Christ. Okay, some of these questions are intense. What part of yourself are you still pretending is temporary? This tells you a lot about my AI mirror, that he'd ask such a thing. What part of yourself are you still pretending is temporary? I think desire for base pleasures. I think I do struggle with the idea that sort of base bodily pleasures and desire is not in fact temporary, and it's an innate part of being human. But obviously the fact that I'm admitting that arguably makes it such that I'm not pretending. But I think that's probably the closest thing to an answer there. If we ignore that contradiction, that any answer would mean I'm not pretending. if you were raised by philosophers instead of parents, what would have gone better and worse? I love this question. So what would have gone better? I would have, not that my parents are materialistic, but I think I probably would have been more armed against the materialism of the modern world, and I would try and fight things on a more cerebral playing field, depending on the philosopher. What would have gone worse is, I think, my ability to connect with people, obviously, and when you talk to PhD students, many of them experience struggling to talk to anyone normally, especially about their research. Obviously, there are some very social PhD students as well, but I think those are the two big ones. Would have been more armed against materialism, and at an earlier age would have, perhaps not at an earlier age, but during my teen years when I was somewhat co-opted by ideology, and in some respects would have been slightly more armed against it. And yet, in spite of that, probably would have struggled to connect to people, especially if I was processing everything through abstract reasoning and logic, which is already something I do. But my parents are already fairly philosophical. But fun question. So next one. Which of your vices is most honest? These are some crazy questions, I must say. Any of you out there creating psychological profiles of yourself, I can absolutely recommend asking it to ask you questions for a Q&A. What a brilliant concept. So which of your vices is most honest? I think, somewhat paradoxically to what I said earlier, I think indulgence in base pleasures and bodily pleasures. We could go salacious with it, or let's be a bit more PG. Food. And I think it's just a very honest reflection of, I like tasty food. It makes me feel good and nourished and happy to be alive. And so I think that binge eating, I would have described as a vice. Should clarify, I'm not saying eating nice food is a vice. But binge eating, I would have classed, perhaps erroneously, but certainly I would have classed as a vice. And probably would fit the bill. But it was still fairly honest. And the binge eating in particular is a way to, not that I was ever a serious binge eater, I never was seriously overweight or anything like that, but I would often not eat with the purpose of then eating a huge meal to satiate both my body and soul. And I think that was still fairly honest, because it was not only responding to a genuine bodily desire, but it was truly comforting. Would you rather be admirable or understood? I think admirable, honestly. That is my gut reaction. I'd rather people admire me than understand me, I think. But I think in personal relationships, that could be quite shallow. But I'm not actually going to overly intellectualize that answer, because that is a gut reaction. What would you rather be? My honest answer, I think admirable. But again, personal relationships would suffer a bit, and being understood is one of the greatest things in this world. So very interesting, perhaps a somewhat tense point in my mind. So there's another section which is on ADHD, compulsion, and self-control. Okay, this is hilarious. What's the most absurd thing that's ever overwhelmed you? Honest answer, choosing Warhammer armies as a kid. I used to have a complete breakdown. I used to buy models and then return them and then never buy them again because I was terrified that I'd make the wrong decision. I would start new armies and then stop them and start new armies, and I would just feel so guilty in like a true moral sense. It was bad. So definitely the most absurd thing that's ever overwhelmed me was choosing my Warhammer 40k specifically armies, or occasionally Warhammer Fantasy. Not that I ever made a full fantasy army though. Again, all of this part of the overwhelm. Have you ever, quote unquote, earned your dopamine? Oh yeah. I mean, it's definitely something I've struggled with, but in this paradigm that this AI has presented me with, the idea of earning dopamine, I have definitely. Most notably when I was playing badminton, I would say, walking hours and hours and hours to train for hours and hours and hours, being in pain because of it, injuring yourself and then pushing through. Not that that's very healthy, but that was genuine effort and pain for the result of pleasure. And I'm assuming that's what is meant here. The other one is through doing terrible work that I found really, really difficult. I say terrible, it's not fiberglass in your lungs, coal miner, retail job type difficulty, but work that I was misaligned with that I found very difficult, that I didn't enjoy at all for a very long time. Well, I say very long, I'm only 25, so a year or two. Particularly one period of, say, about 6 months, because I was on the graduate scheme for a lot of that, of my a lot of my working life, and so periods of that, I think perhaps the whole thing left me at the end able to be much more sensitive to the world, because my dopaminergic systems and my dopamine receptors were so sensitive due to the lack of dopamine that suddenly I feel great. So in that sense, I feel like I've earned my dopamine. But I try not to look at things in necessarily that framework exclusively, at least not without smuggling in moralistic tendencies. Or rather, I try and look at it without smuggling in those moralistic tendencies. And this idea of earning, to me, sounds slightly moralistic. So the next one, what's the dumbest task that's ever made you cry? I don't think there's a task that's ever actually made me cry. So I'm going to have to pass on that one. When do you trust your own mind the least? I mean, we all know when we trust our mind the least. It's when you're yearning for something and you're searching for it. I'll leave it at that. Okay. What's your most sophisticated form of procrastination? Creating a psychographic profile of myself and uploading hundreds of thousands of very in-depth, spontaneous journal entries, meta commentaries, and writing models and modes of interpretation for my own AI. Again, nothing coding related there. I'm not pretending to be a coding whiz, just all through language models. Arguably, it's not complete procrastination, because sometimes I was doing it for its own sake because I found it meaningful. But in some instances, I think that was also procrastination. Definitely most sophisticated. Next one. Do you respect deadlines or just fear them? I actually really respect them. I think deadlines can really help you know what's expected of you. The fact that it's saying or just fear them now sort of outs me as being afraid of deadlines. I do respect them. I find deadlines useful. For things you don't like, obviously they're not ideal. So the next section seems to be about work. Also, pausing this, I hope you're enjoying this. I'm surprised if you've listened this far, but amazing if you have. So the next section seems to be about work, ambition, and corporate life. I'm going to blast through some of these because I think these are slightly less exciting. Do you want an empire or just a life without alarms? I definitely do want an empire and also a life without alarms. I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. I definitely want both. Would you rather be impressive or unbothered? I think impressive. This is much like one of the previous questions we had. I'm just going to answer it as a gut reaction. Next, when did you realise being good at your job might be a trap? I don't think I ever framed it in this way, but I do remember seeing the directors and the managing directors and even the chairs of my company talking on the other side of the table to the people presenting and thinking, so that's the goal, that's what everyone wants to be, that's where you end up if you're truly good and you play the game, and I don't want to be there. So I'm not necessarily saying that being good at your job I felt was a trap, but I could definitely see how being good could lead to a type of success that wasn't necessarily what you're after. What's your most irrational workplace rage? It's not completely irrational, but being asked to try and come in earlier when I religiously try and come in early, and I'm usually early. That probably did. But that's not irrational, because that is fairly rational. I think, here's an irrational one. Being really it's not quite a rage, but frustrated and concerned about seeing a Warhammer figure in the office and wanting to take a picture of it, but feeling like it would make me look really awkward. So, there's maybe another, there should be a better one. That's not really a rage, that's just like mild anxiety. What's your most irrational workplace rage? Sound off in the comments if you've got your own workplace rage. I think for me, my most irrational, again, you might call it slightly rational, is just how much people talk about golf. I think that's probably fairly rational, but how frustrated it makes me, maybe a bit irrational. Next, is your productivity a form of self-respect or self-escape? Jesus Christ. I think, sound off in the comments if you've got an opinion on whether or not your productivity is a form of self-respect or a self-escape. I don't know how it could be a form of self-escape. Perhaps if you're indulging in it so much that you don't have to address real underlying questions, which I think is fair. But for me, unless that is, of course, the case, and I've not processed that, productivity has come alongside self-exploration. It's come alongside, particularly now, internal work psychotherapy. And so productivity is a necessary need in my life with what I want to do. And I can do it alongside self-exploration, I hope. So the next section, oh God, relationships, class, and identity. What's something about you people always get wrong? Okay, obviously class background. Next, do you feel more comfortable being envied or underestimated? Oh, that's rough. Sound off in the comments if you've got an opinion on this. I think in abstract reading this, want to say envied, but maybe in person I'll get frustrated. No, I actually think envied is the correct answer. Nobody likes to be, I don't love to be envied in conversation, but I definitely think it does play to some sort of innate ego drive or some sort of insecurity. Whereas being underestimated perhaps is slightly easier in terms of not being so competitive, but I definitely think it doesn't appeal to the egoistic side to me, which perhaps has some advantages in life, but I think that level of ego can also be very detrimental. How do you explain yourself? We're on question 22, by the way. If you've made it this far, shout out to you. So how do you explain yourself to people who think Ibiza sounds fun? Well, I think probably the best way is just saying you're autistic would probably be a good way of explaining it to people. Not that I've ever explained myself to be that way, but that probably would give a good idea of why why it doesn't sound fun. How do I explain yourself to people who think Ibiza sounds fun? I don't, I suppose, is the honest answer. I just don't need to explain myself to them. Nothing against Ibiza, except the idea of doing it myself. Next, which version of you are your parents still trying to reach? Jesus Christ. I don't think I have the time to address this question seriously and do it justice here. And I can't believe it's asked this question. That's remarkable. But for me, I don't think there is a part of me that they're trying to reach anyway. But I could probably address that question in more depth. But I don't have the capacity for that right now. Next. Is your class background something you escaped or something you misunderstood? I think it's probably both. By all accounts, really from a much more middle class background than I think some have assumed me to be. But you could argue that I've escaped my class background through, at least my personal class background, not worrying about my heritage, my individual, personal upbringing. So I wouldn't have escaped it as such, but I would have escaped in some people's minds, particularly those who haven't met, real aristocrats, I might have escaped the image of middle class by going beyond it in some people's eyes. But again, usually those are people who haven't been around the level of stratospherically posh people that they are associating me with. Or something you misunderstood was the other part of that question. I also misunderstood it completely, and I didn't understand my own class background until a long amount of deep thinking and internal work was done. Ridiculous, I know, but it genuinely took a long time to unravel. I say deep, that's not to say it was particularly profound, but rather excavating a level of my consciousness that required me to see things clearly. Last, dark humour / the edge. If someone made a documentary about your life, what would the title be and what would you not want them to include? Okay, well, I can't answer this without outing myself in various things. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to pass this question. 26. What's something you used to think was heroic that now just seems like trauma? I think self-flagellation. I think self-harm, which doesn't have to necessarily be physically wounding oneself. But I think that the sort of nobility in self-flagellation is not as heroic as people make it out to be. Being able to suffer for something profound, yes, meaningful, but suffering for the sake of suffering, I think, is sometimes just masochistic and not, in fact, a sign of nobility. Second to last question. Which of your opinions would most alienate your friends if you said it plainly? I don't think I have one, because I think I have good friends and also fairly justifiable opinions. I'm not going to guess, though, particularly because that would not be appropriate for this content. Next, and also I'm working through most of my more controversial ideas. I'm always rigorously scrutinizing, so I probably wouldn't be confident enough to say them. And if I was, again, it's not the avenue. Next, and the final question. What's something you suspect you might never fully fix, but still need to try? I think, genuinely, linking it back to ADHD, having complete control over your body. And I don't mean that in terms of basic bodily functions. I mean in terms of moving your body to action. I mean in terms of what we might technically refer to as motivational salience. Understanding a goal as desirable and your body moving towards it. You could call it discipline. I more mean a genuine alignment between your body moving and walking in the way and towards what you're after. And I think I am extraordinarily aligned with this in comparison to how I was in the past. And perhaps you could argue that's not something that needs to be fixed. But I think it's fair to say that I might never be always completely aligned with everything I always want to do at every moment of every day. But aligning yourself with the person you want to be in your ideal, you have to try. And I think, as futile as it may be, that is a noble pursuit. And it doesn't have to become self-flagellation. Well, that was a really fun video for me. I hope you found it interesting. And I think that's a really good one to end on. Sound off in the comments if you've got any answers to any of these weird questions, what you think about the experiment, and what you think about the video. Right, peace out.